In the heart of Sandringham, a single closed door signalled the start of a silent war. Just moments before the council convened, Prince Edward made an unthinkable move, barring Prince Andrew's most trusted advisor from entry. What unfolded next would rattle the foundations of royal decision-making and reveal fractures the public never saw coming. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The corridors of Sandringham were filled with tension as senior royals gathered for what was supposed to be a critical strategy session. Security was tighter than usual, whispers buzzed through the hallways, and every step taken by a royal aide echoed louder than it should have. This was no ordinary council meeting, it was a turning point. On the agenda were sensitive issues involving legacy preservation, restructuring internal protocols, and navigating media scrutiny following a string of royal missteps. But before a single word was officially spoken, a storm erupted outside the grand chamber doors. Prince Andrew's advisor, a man many referred to as his shadow strategist, approached the entrance with quiet confidence, badge in hand, as he had done countless times before. But this time was different. Palace security, acting on direct orders from Prince Edward himself, refused him entry. The man froze, clearly shocked. He wasn't just being delayed, he was being locked out. Staff nearby paused, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. When one of the guards discreetly leaned in to clarify, "This comes directly from Prince Edward," the air changed. Just moments later, Andrew arrived. He was met not with ceremony but with confusion. Whispers reached his ears before official confirmation did. The moment he learned his advisor had been barred, his composure cracked. Witnesses say he clenched his jaw, his eyes scanning the hallway like a man betrayed. He asked, "On whose authority?" And when told it was Edward's, he fell silent for just a second before a storm of restrained fury rose within him. What was meant to be a day of quiet, coordinated leadership had devolved into a clash of brothers beneath royal ceilings. The identity of the advisor added fuel to the fire. He wasn't just a background figure, he had, over the years, become central to Andrew's navigation through scandal and controversy. Rumours swirled about his influence over legal strategies, press decisions, and even internal palace whispers. Some feared he wielded more power than even senior aides. For Edward to block him wasn't merely procedural, it was personal, political, and strategic. What many didn't realise at that moment was this action wasn't spontaneous. It had been building silently for months. Edward, calm on the surface, had been watching, calculating, and waiting. This wasn't the act of a man pushed too far in the heat of the moment, it was a message, delivered in silence but heard across every marble hallway of the monarchy. It said, the old ways were no longer welcome, and shadows would no longer shape the future of the crown. But to understand why Prince Edward made such a decisive move, we must go back to the whispers, the secrets, and the quiet maneuvers that led to this dramatic confrontation. Few know his name, but he's been shaping Prince Andrew's decisions from the shadows for years. With deep ties to controversial legal teams and foreign assets, this advisor's presence at the palace had always drawn silent unease. Now, he's at the centre of the most high-stakes royal exclusion in decades. Long before the door was shut in his face at Sandringham, the man now at the centre of royal speculation had already built an invisible fortress around Prince Andrew. Whispers of his origins trace back to an elite military intelligence unit, though official records remain conveniently blurred. What's known is that he operated in a world where discretion was survival and manipulation, a refined art. When Andrew fell from public grace, it wasn't palace advisors who handled the damage. It was this man, stepping in not just as a consultant, but as a commander. The cleanup wasn't polished, but it was brutal, and within that brutality, Andrew found loyalty. This advisor didn't just steer Andrew's responses, he curated them. He crafted press releases like battle plans and selected legal representatives as if deploying soldiers to war. Every public statement, every courtroom maneuver, every whispered denial to the tabloids bore his fingerprint. And while the rest of the family distanced themselves from scandal, he dug in deeper, embedding himself in every layer of Andrew's operations. Media requests were filtered, visitors pre-approved, Even Andrew's inner circle was shrunk down to those deemed operationally secure. He didn't just control the messaging, he became the message. Inside the palace, the unease was palpable. Staffers spoke cautiously around him, uncertain of what information would be relayed and to whom. He was never officially employed by the crown, yet wielded influence as if he had the Queen's seal. His methods were aggressive, favouring intimidation over negotiation, and his presence during strategy meetings often led to abrupt silence or sudden exits. Some senior aides questioned how Andrew could still lean on a figure so detached from royal tradition, so far removed from the codes of integrity that bound the House of Windsor. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. Andrew trusted him not because of his royal understanding, but because of his unflinching loyalty. Yet behind closed doors, others were watching. Prince William, ever the statesman in training, reportedly raised private concerns to his father and Princess Anne about the advisor's unchecked role. Catherine, known for her poise, allegedly referred to him in confidence as the whisper that turns storms into strategy. They saw not just a man, but a threat, one who could reinsert Andrew into royal circles under a veil of careful influence. But no one moved publicly. Not until Edward. Because while the rest of the family deliberated, Prince Edward was documenting every meeting, every misstep, every hidden attempt to maneuver power. The tension hadn't just grown, it had calcified. And when Edward finally acted, it wasn't from impulse. It was a precise strike against a man whose existence had destabilized the palace long enough. But Prince Edward didn't make his decision in isolation. This was a calculated risk, born of hidden alliances and growing frustration behind palace doors. While headlines focused on William and Charles, Prince Edward was building something else entirely, a silent network of influence, trust, and quiet authority. And when the time came, he used it. But what drove him to take on Andrew so openly, and who backed him from within? Prince Edward had always been underestimated. Lacking the tabloid magnetism of his older brothers and the revolutionary aura of the next generation, he remained largely overlooked in royal coverage. But what the world missed, the palace didn't. Edward had been paying attention, not to flashbulbs or press narratives, but to protocol, perception, and power. And over the past year, while the spotlight dazzled elsewhere, Edward began to shape a more deliberate role for himself behind closed doors. His presence at council meetings became more pointed, his opinions sharper, and his decisions harder to ignore. It wasn't noise, he was building a foundation, quietly, strategically, and not alone. Alongside him, two equally underestimated forces emerged, Princess Anne and Sophie, Countess of Wessex. Anne brought her signature discipline and institutional memory. Sophie, her discretion and emotional intelligence. Together with Edward, they formed a new axis inside the royal structure, one that prioritized clarity, discipline, and legacy over reputation repair. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a course correction, and Andrew was becoming the problem none of them could ignore. His return to the public sphere, even in whispers, sent alarm bells through Edward's growing network. It wasn't about personal grudges, it was about image, responsibility, and the fragile equilibrium of a monarchy still grieving its matriarch. Edward's tensions with Andrew didn't explode overnight. They had been simmering since the early 2000s, deepening with every scandal, and compounded by Andrew's inability to read the changing tides of public tolerance. In private, Edward had raised concerns about how Andrew's actions reflected on the entire institution. But his words, back then, fell on cautious ears. That changed after Elizabeth's passing. The new era demanded a different kind of vigilance, and Edward, fiercely loyal to the late Queen's standards, began drafting a vision of a monarchy cleansed of its shadows. He didn't want to punish Andrew, he wanted to protect what was left. The shift became visible in small moments. Edward pushing back in council meetings, requesting transparency protocols around unofficial advisors, advocating for structured roles and restricted access. These weren't symbolic moves, they were foundational shifts. Behind each recommendation lay a calculated intention to box out the old ghosts quietly attempting to re-enter. But the tipping point came weeks before the Sandringham meeting, during a private briefing Edward received from a senior intelligence contact. Though details remain tightly sealed, sources say the briefing included communications between Andrew's advisor and external entities seeking influence over royal charitable structures. For Edward, that was it. The decision was made. The lines were drawn. What followed wasn't a dramatic declaration, but a controlled tightening of gates. Conversations were had, agreements formed with Anne and Sophie, support quietly secured, and when the day arrived, Edward didn't hesitate. He acted, not out of rage, but duty. The kind of duty that demands silence until it's time to speak through action. The door was closed, the message loud and unambiguous. Yet while Edward rose quietly, Andrew's return strategy was growing bolder, fueled by his advisor's audacious plan to regain influence, no matter the cost. He wasn't just attending a council meeting, he was staging a comeback. Sources close to the palace suggest Andrew's advisor had drafted a bold proposal to restructure royal representation, but buried inside was a hidden clause that would have rocked the family's future. The document wasn't supposed to exist. And yet, within days of the council meeting, a confidential memorandum began quietly circulating through discreet channels. Not addressed to the king or the wider royal staff, but leaked strategically to select figures known for their allegiance to older royal traditions. The proposal, authored in the language of reform and unity, was in reality a carefully veiled map to Andrew's return to public life. At its surface, it called for a re-evaluation of current royal roles, with an emphasis on redeeming overlooked legacies. But deep within, buried in bureaucratic phrasing and footnotes, was a single clause. Prince Andrew would assume oversight of a newly formed Royal Charitable Oversight Board. On paper, it appeared administrative. In truth, it was a direct gateway to influence and control. This clause would have granted Andrew authority over funding flows, public-facing events, and decision-making tied to legacy institutions, many of which were founded or personally nurtured by Queen Elizabeth herself. It wasn't just a power move, it was a reclamation attempt cloaked in philanthropy, and the target wasn't the press or the public, it was the monarchy's internal structure. The very soul of the institution was at stake. Behind closed doors, the advisor had been working tirelessly, calling in old favours, reactivating long-dormant alliances with aging courtiers still nostalgic for Andrew's pre-scandal days. One by one, he courted their sympathies, playing on shared histories and royal memories to rally subtle support. The advisor believed he had the perfect timing. With Charles navigating international duties and dealing with his own health whispers, the moment seemed ripe. The king, he believed, was distracted, vulnerable even. The idea was simple. Sneak the proposal through under the pretext of administrative housekeeping, gather enough quiet nods of support, and by the time anyone raised a flag, the structure would already be in place. A royal shadow government built not through crowns, but committees. Andrew, once banished from duty, would return not through royal decree, but through paperwork and pressure. But not everyone was blind to the play. Edward, through his expanding inner circle and deepening connections to intelligence briefings, intercepted the leak just days before the scheduled meeting. At first, he couldn't believe the audacity, but as he read the full extent of the advisor's strategy page by page, manipulation by manipulation, he realized the stakes had shifted. This wasn't about Andrew reclaiming reputation. This was about reclaiming influence. And for Edward, that crossed the line. It was no longer just about scandal control or media optics. It was about the structural integrity of the monarchy. So, when the advisor walked toward the council chamber, Edward wasn't just blocking a man, he was preventing a hostile internal coup masked as reform. Palace walls are thick, but not thick enough to muffle the fury that erupted that morning. Eyewitnesses claim Andrew's voice echoed through the East Wing as he confronted his brother. What began as a protest became a personal reckoning, decades in the making. The confrontation came fast, too fast for anyone to contain. Word of his advisor's exclusion had reached him en route, but it wasn't until he was face to face with Edward that the dam truly broke. What was supposed to be a dignified entrance turned into a charged showdown in the heart of the palace. Andrew, red-faced and visibly shaking, demanded an explanation not as a prince but as a brother betrayed. His words were a barrage of accusations, sharp and unfiltered, dredging up grievances buried for decades. He spoke of favoritism, of being pushed aside after years of service, of being sacrificed to preserve the reputations of others while he alone carried the public shame. Edward didn't flinch. Surrounded by aides who quickly stepped back, he stood his ground with the composure of a man who had long prepared for this moment. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the tension with a single, unforgettable sentence. "You don't get to rewrite history." That phrase, those 8 words, hit harder than any scream, because they weren't just a rebuttal, they were a verdict. Edward wasn't going to argue. He was drawing a line, and behind that line stood years of patience, duty, and resolve. What Andrew saw in that moment wasn't just a brother. It was a gatekeeper, and the gate had slammed shut. Security teams remained nearby, discreet but alert, aware that the energy was no longer political, it was volatile. The temperature in the corridor dropped as the emotional weight bore down. For a moment, it wasn't about titles or positions. It was about 2 men who had grown up under the same roof, who had witnessed the same crown shape their childhoods in very different ways, and who had now reached the breaking point. Staff members later described the encounter as a cold war inside the family, a rupture that no protocol could mend. It was Sophie who stepped forward. Ever composed, ever diplomatic, she moved between them with quiet strength. No grand speech, no public scolding, just a few measured words that brought the temperature down just enough for Andrew to step back. But the damage had been done. He turned and walked away from the chamber, refusing to take his place at the table. It was a protest, yes, but it was also an admission. The doors had closed, and he was no longer welcome on the other side. But what neither brother expected was what came next, the Queen Consort's quiet intervention, and the message she delivered behind closed doors. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call for aids. Camilla simply walked past Edward's shoulder and whispered a single sentence that left him frozen. The Queen Consort's influence is rarely visible, but in that moment, it became undeniable. Camilla's entrance was quiet, almost deliberately so. No grand arrival, no announcement, just a subtle presence slipping through the corridor at the height of the tension. By the time she arrived, the echoes of Andrew's fury were still hanging in the air, and the energy was sharp, fragile, and unpredictable. She paused briefly beside Edward, took in the faces around her, then leaned in. Her voice, barely audible to anyone but him, carried a weight far greater than its volume. "The king can't see you divided. Not today." A sentence so simple, yet so piercing, it halted Edward mid-thought. In that instant, everything around him slowed. The political became personal, the strategic became delicate. Was it a warning? A rebuke? A plea? Or perhaps all 3 at once? No one around them could decipher the tone. And perhaps that was the point. Camilla had mastered the art of subtle power not by demanding obedience, but by planting questions that lingered long after she walked away. Her message didn't instruct Edward to reverse his decision. It didn't ask for compromise. It simply reframed the battlefield. This wasn't just about Andrew anymore. This was about the face the family would present to the king, fractured or united, decisive or divided. And that mattered. Observers noted a shift in Edward after that exchange. He didn't undo what he had done, but he recalibrated. His tone in the moments that followed was measured, even diplomatic. He moved from confrontation to consolidation. No more declarations. No visible tension. It was as if the storm had passed on the surface. But beneath it, Edward was still watching, still calculating. He hadn't changed course. He had simply changed his pace. Later that afternoon, rumors began swirling that Camilla had held a private meeting with Andrew. No aides were present, no schedule recorded. Just a closed door and 2 individuals whose histories with the crown were complicated, burdened, and interlinked. What was said inside that room remains a mystery. Some believe she urged Andrew to let it go, to retreat for the sake of the monarchy's fragile balance. Others insist she offered something softer, an assurance that this wasn't the end, just a pause. Regardless, the timing couldn't be ignored. The Queen Consort, often described as a stabilizing presence beside a burdened king, had chosen to intervene not with force, but with whisper and suggestion, and somehow, in doing so, she had redirected the day's momentum. Edward, for all his planning, had just been reminded that power in the palace doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes, it speaks in riddles and moves like a shadow. Yet as Camilla played diplomat, a new force was quietly arriving at Windsor, a figure whose presence would shift the narrative in an entirely new direction. When Prince William entered the chamber, the air changed. No longer the silent observer, he issued an ultimatum that would split loyalties and expose secret allegiances within the council. For the first time, he wielded power like a future king and made it personal. It was mid-meeting when the tension peaked. Just as the dust from Camilla's intervention had barely settled, and senior royals tried to realign themselves in the aftermath of Andrew's withdrawal, a private aide hurried through the chamber's side door and whispered into Edward's ear. Within moments, all eyes turned to the rear as William strode in, not with formality, but with a purpose that needed no announcement. He had been briefed, and he was livid. The heir snapped to attention as he took his place, not beside his father, but beside his uncle, a symbolic gesture that immediately made the room sit straighter. No greetings, no niceties. Just his voice, low but unmistakably clear. Anyone advising Andrew will be removed from proximity to this institution, effective immediately. What followed was not discussion, it was a reckoning. William had kept quiet for long enough, watching the internal fractures widen, tolerating diplomacy while the undercurrent of manipulation threatened the monarchy's future. But this time, the target wasn't just Andrew. It was the culture of enabling. It was the shadows creeping back under royal doors. He looked around the room and made it plain this wasn't up for debate. If any member of the council, advisor, or external affiliate attempted to shield, assist, or even liaise with Andrew's controversial inner circle, they would find themselves frozen out of royal operations. Completely. Princess Anne, ever the stoic guardian of tradition, backed him without hesitation. A single nod from her across the table was enough to signal that the old guard had shifted. Catherine, composed but visibly resolute, echoed her support in quieter but no less significant ways. With William, Anne, and Edward now clearly aligned, the remaining voices in the room had no choice but to recalibrate. A trio of calm, calculated authority had taken shape, and their message was unshakable. Protect the future, or step aside. But William wasn't finished. What began as a statement quickly evolved into a threat with real consequences. He made it clear that if even a whisper of Andrew's advisor found its way into programs associated with the Cambridge household, especially those involving Prince George or next-generation planning, those initiatives would be suspended. Funding paused. Access revoked. William, for the first time in public record, had made a royal conflict generational. It wasn't just about Andrew anymore, it was about safeguarding the monarchy for his children, and in doing so, he made the stakes visceral, real. After the session concluded, William and Edward were seen walking the perimeter gardens of the estate, deep in conversation, heads bowed, gestures sharp. Nearly an hour passed. When they returned, a new tone had taken hold in the palace, a decisive, sharpened one. Something had shifted, and the message was clear. This was no longer a family matter. It was a matter of legacy. But even as William took control, a new document was about to surface, one written by the Queen herself before her passing, and sealed until now. Locked in a private vault for over a year, the Queen's sealed memorandum wasn't meant to be opened unless the family stood at a crossroads. When Charles read its contents aloud, silence fell. Elizabeth had foreseen this moment and left behind instructions that would shake the room. No one in the chamber had anticipated it. The existence of such a letter had been rumoured, even speculated about in hushed tones between senior aides, but no one truly believed it was real until the king reached beneath the table and revealed a thin envelope marked only with the Queen's personal seal and the chilling instruction, to be opened upon council crisis. The moment those words were spoken, the atmosphere turned sacred. The political tension of the morning gave way to something deeper, something ancestral. All eyes turned to Charles, whose hands trembled ever so slightly as he broke the wax and unfolded the paper inside. The air was still. The power in the room had shifted, now held in the voice of a monarch no longer present, yet still commanding. The letter, written in Elizabeth's unmistakable hand, was more than a message. It was a reckoning. She spoke not of positions or titles, but of character, of what the crown should symbolize when tested. She wrote of legacy, sacrifice, and above all, integrity. In a passage that would later be quoted across royal circles, she warned of the burden of association and how the wrong counsel, when tolerated, could compromise centuries of service in mere minutes. And then came the line that ended all debate. If influence outweighs trust, the gates must close. With that, the room froze. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decree. Charles read the sentence twice. Some say he faltered the second time, the words nearly catching in his throat. Others noticed Catherine, seated beside William, quietly lower her gaze as tears welled in her eyes. For Edward, it was validation not just of action, but of principle. He had stood alone for so long, driven by a moral compass he couldn't always justify aloud. Now, the Queen had drawn the same line he did, and done so long before the conflict had even unfolded. It was as if she had known the fault lines in her family would eventually quake. She hadn't named names, but she didn't need to. Andrew, who had remained outside the chamber since his confrontation, was reportedly handed a copy of the letter moments later. Sources claim he read it once and said nothing, simply turning and walking away. Whether in defiance, resignation, or grief, no one could be certain. But the letter had done what no whispered counsel or shouted warning could. It had closed the door. Officially. Unquestionably. In the wake of the Queen's voice echoing across the table from beyond the grave, the council sat in solemn unity. No more arguments, no more manoeuvring, only the clarity that came from a monarch who had led not just with power, but with foresight. But even as the Queen's words sealed one chapter, a final twist remained, one that would place an unexpected name in the center of the monarchy's future. As the dust settled, a surprising voice rose from the back of the room. Sophie, Countess of Wessex, long seen as a quiet consort, stepped forward with a message that stunned the council. With dignity and clarity, she revealed a vision for a monarchy that could heal, and she might just lead it. The chamber, still heavy with the echoes of the Queen's final words, had fallen into a stunned silence. It was a moment no one wanted to disturb. And yet, it was in that silence that Sophie stood. Her presence was calm, unassuming, but her voice carried with it a gravity that pierced through every lingering whisper of division. In a few short sentences, she spoke not as a politician or strategist, but as a mother, a wife, and a woman who had watched the crown bend under the weight of scandal, conflict, and silent grudges. Her message was not one of blame, it was one of redirection. She called for unity, for transparency, and most of all, for a conscious effort to protect the generation that would inherit the consequences of every decision made in that room. She reminded them that the monarchy was not merely a lineage, it was a promise, and that promise had been bruised. Sophie's words weren't laced with grand gestures or royal platitudes. They were grounded, deliberate, and unshakably honest. She did not name Andrew, she didn't need to. Her focus was on the future not just of the institution, but of those growing up within its orbit. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, Prince Louis. Her voice carried a quiet urgency that was impossible to ignore. We cannot allow today's shadows to become tomorrow's legacy. Across the table, Princess Anne gave a single nod, firm, approving. Catherine, eyes still red from the emotional weight of the Queen's letter, looked toward Sophie with unmistakable respect. For the first time in years, the three most influential women in the House of Windsor appeared aligned, not in title, but in intent. And that alignment was not symbolic. It was seismic. The tone of the council shifted immediately. What had begun as a battle for control slowly transformed into a conversation about responsibility, boundaries, and values. The final twist came moments later when Camilla, who had until now maintained a cautious neutrality, publicly endorsed Sophie's words. With a rare show of public alignment, the Queen Consort called the Countess's remarks timely and necessary, further solidifying the idea that a quiet but irreversible transformation was underway. The vote that followed was swift, unanimous, and historic. A new code of conduct was drafted for all external advisors, a blueprint to ensure no one outside the royal core could again manipulate, mislead, or distort royal decisions without transparency or accountability. As palace walls hold their breath, one thing is clear: the monarchy's next chapter won't be shaped by secrets or shadows, but by those who dare to speak when it matters most. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.